Hi everybody, Shane here, just dropping in briefly before today's episode begins. Followers of the podcast will notice something a little different today. You're about to hear a new voice in the host's chair. I'm delighted to introduce Bryan Boling to you all. He's joining as a guest host today for this episode, and we hope many, many more. Bryan's a long-time Spybrary listener and watcher, a thoughtful reader of the genre, and someone who shares our love for spy fiction and espionage history. Today, Bryan is in conversation with David Goodman, the author of A Reluctant Spy, a debut that many of you already know, much lauded, it won awards, and generated a lot of excitement within the Spybrary community. Even Spybrary doyens like Tim Shipman were raving about this one, and actually Tim has just published a post at spybrary.com about his books he's excited to read in 2026, and David Goodman's second book is listed there. So listen, I want to take a moment to say thank you to Bryan for stepping in here. I put the call out towards the end of last year for guest hosts, and I tell you why I did it. Is I get tons of authors, and I'm very, very grateful to you all and to our publishers who email asking to come on the show to talk about the latest spy book that you've published. I'm just one guy. I have other interests, believe it or not, than Spybrary. I don't always have the time to be able to do justice to an author, and I always want to read the author's book before having them on the show. So I thought, why not? Why don't we get the talent spotters out and recruit some guest hosts? So Bryan stepped forward along with another chap that you will hear in a couple of weeks. And if you're interested in potentially being a guest host on Spybrary, drop me a line at shane@spybrary.com. So enjoy this episode. I know I really enjoyed producing it. And please give Bryan Boling and Dave Goodman a warm Spybrary welcome.
Do you love spy books, movies, and TV? Then the Spybrary podcast is for you.
Welcome to the Spybrary podcast. I'm Bryan Boling with you today, and I have a guest with me. David Goodman is a name that a lot of our Spybrarians are familiar with. He has a debut book out, A Reluctant Spy, and we thought we'd get him on the podcast to chat a little bit about it. Welcome to the podcast, Dave.
Thank you very much for having me.
So I have to say, I read your book not too long ago, really enjoyed it. I know there's a lot of people out there in the community talking about it. There's a lot of folks out there who have heard of it and they're not really sure kind of if it's up their alley or not. So hopefully we'll give them a little insight today and get more people reading your book.
Absolutely.
Let's start out with a little background. For those people who don't know you or aren't familiar with you, this is your first novel, right? A Reluctant Spy.
First published novel.
Novel, right? Yeah. So give us an idea. What's your background in writing? How long have you been writing? What else have you written? Stuff like that.
I've been writing since I was quite a small boy. Really, I think the first short stories and things that I wrote was probably in my very early teens and maybe even preteen. But I started writing seriously when I was at university, at sort of 17, 18 years old, and wrote the whole way through uni, but it's mostly horror and stuff like that. I was at uni in Aberdeen, and I was part of the Creative Writing Society. I was slightly out of place in that group because I was writing stuff that wasn't terribly literary, but it's kind of much more commercial. I wasn't thinking of it as commercial at the time. There was a guy I met once at a thing. He said, "The thing I like about your stories, Dave, when I come to these events is they have a beginning, middle, and an end." So to give you an idea of the kind of thing I was writing and the kind of thing that maybe some of my peers weren't writing. But I kept writing when I moved to London for a job, and eventually did NaNoWriMo in 2005, which is 20 years ago now, which is terrifying. So that's National Novel Writing Month, and I wrote my first sort of full-length novel at that time, which was really, really bad. It was a thriller. It was a kind of science fiction thriller, and it didn't go anywhere. I tried to query it, but I didn't really know what I was doing, so it just kind of languished in a drawer. And then I wrote about another 6 or 7 books over the next 10, 15 years, until about 2019, when I sat down and said, no, I need to figure this out. I need to stop just producing drafts and throwing them over my shoulder and actually try and edit something into a publishable form, which is how I got to not this book. There's another 3 books to go before this book. I wrote a book called The Burning Line, which is a near future spy thriller. It's kind of climate change thriller, which is what got me representation with my agent Harry. And Harry then took that out on submission, and it didn't sell, which is extremely common. And he said, "Have you thought about a spy thriller?" And that kind of took me right back, because he said this book is basically a spy thriller, but it's set in the future. And I did my dissertation at Aberdeen University on spy fiction, so I did John le Carré and Graham Greene. So I'd kind of fallen out of reading spy fiction for a long, long time. I read them essentially because I wanted to read books that I was actually interested in reading when I was doing my dissertation. So I did The Honourable Schoolboy, Our Man in Havana, and The Spy Who Came In From the Cold. And it was all about paranoia and spy fiction. And it's not a very good dissertation. Nobody read it. I think it is in the university library in Aberdeen. But I then kind of was cast back to this conversation I had with my professor at the time. When he read my dissertation, he said, "You should try writing one of these yourself one day." And that kind of stuck in my head. So when Harry suggested I write a contemporary spy thriller, I said, "Okay, I'll give it a go." And I wrote a spy thriller, which is not this book. It's a book called The Disaster Club that also didn't sell, which again, is very common. So I was sort of 2 down with no no result, and I was kind of feeling, this is sort of 2022-ish, and I was starting to feel a bit twitchy and wondering if I'd made the right decisions. And then we started talking to Toby Jones, who's the editor at Headline, and he said, "I really like your writing, but I can't buy these 2 books for various reasons, but have you got any other ideas?" And that's how we pitched Reluctant Spy.
So for those of listeners who may not be familiar with the book, give us sort of like a brief overview.
Absolutely. So this was one of several ideas that I pitched to Toby, and this was the one that he kind of jumped on because it was quite pitchable. So the core idea is that there's in fact, I'll tell you how it came about. So I had a line in my idea file that just said spy novel where real people lend their identities to spies. And that just sat in my idea file for years and years and years until Jamie Tulk came along, who's the main character. And the kind of combination of a slightly anxious Scotsman in London, slightly out of his depth, with that idea was the sort of genesis of the story. So it's about this guy, Jamie Tulloch, who is living and working in London. But we sort of jump back at the start of the book, and he's at Cambridge, and he's from a background where he doesn't really have many of the sort of safety nets and advantages of some of his peers at Cambridge. And he gets approached by this MI6 program, or SIS. I'm quite particular about using the correct naming in the book. It's kind of running joke in the book. But he gets approached by SIS, and they say, "We will give you everything you currently don't have. So we'll help you find good jobs. We'll pay off your student loans. We'll make sure that you don't end up back where you started from. And in return, you have to step out of your life at some point in the future, and a spy will come along and use your identity." And he says, "Sounds like a good deal to me." I think a lot of people might have their head turned by the idea of having their student loans paid off. And so he agrees, especially in the US. So he agrees to that, and then spends sort of 10 years living this quite hollow existence where he doesn't really have any control over his own life. He can't form any close attachments, and he starts to doubt whether he made the right decision. But then at the start of the book, he gets activated, and he goes to Charles de Gaulle Airport to meet his handler and hand over his passport and, go off on holiday for a few weeks while somebody uses his identity for something. And when he gets there, and this is not really a spoiler because it's quite close to the start of the book, but he finds his handler dead on the floor of a disabled bathroom in Charles de Gaulle, and complications ensue from that point, and he ends up on the mission himself, playing himself, surrounded by sort of quite terrifying characters.
So lots of people out there talk about, kind of creating this unique story, and famously, there's people out there who have said there's really only so many stories to be told. I think John Gardner famously said there's 2 stories, right? A stranger comes to town and a man goes on a mission. You know, and actually, when you were talking about Le Carre, I was actually I'm rereading Spy Who Came for the Cold right now, and was reading it this morning, and it sort of struck me that there's a little bit in that reminds me a little bit of some plot devices that Le Carre uses uh, in The Night Manager, which is another one of his books. And so I thought, well, it's interesting that here's a guy he's really using the same story, the same author using the same story, but he's twisting it around to where if you're not really paying attention, you don't pick it up. And I think that's what makes every story and every novel unique, right? Is the details and the way you do it. And so one of the tropes we find a lot of times in spy fiction is this everyman, right, who gets mixed up in intrigue somehow. But I really like the way you did it with Jamie Tulloch and this idea of the Legends program. I think this is really unique. I think even the CIA said, hey, this is a unique idea that maybe we should look into, right?
Yeah, that was the single strangest day of my first couple of months being a published author, was because I have Google alerts set up that will ping every time somebody posts a review or something like that. And I got one came through, and the URL was cia.gov. I was like, hang on, what's going on here? And I had been in contact with some CIA people, so I asked Barry very kindly blurb the book, and so did David McCloskey for the paperback. So, you know, I had some contact with CIA people, but they're ex-CIA, and it was all very much in the book world rather than the intelligence world. So to have this CIA URL appear in my Google alerts was a bit of a shock. But I clicked through, and it's their in-house magazine, essentially, has a espionage officer's bookshelf, which is actually, for Spybrarians who don't know about it, it's a fantastic resource for finding kind of more realistic spy fiction, or occasionally less realistic spy fiction that nevertheless is enjoyed by officers of the CIA. But it was great, and it said, this is an elegant solution to a thorny problem, perhaps we should adopt it. And my absolute favorite part of that review is that they took the opportunity to have a little dig at MI5 and say the most unrealistic thing in this book is the speed of decision making in London, which I just thought was absolutely savage. But it was very it was a very strange day, but very gratifying to kind of pop up on the radar in that way.
I can imagine. I can imagine that would be very surreal. So, how did you come up with that? You said it was in your kind of ideas folder, and a lot of people who write just kind of keep these, things pop into their head, and you sort of make a note of it. But how did this idea come about?
Yeah, I mean, the ideas folder is one of these things that kind of, it's a bit of a safety blanket. You maybe don't have the skills to execute a particular idea, so you're like, I'm going to save that one for later, or you just, you're generating ideas as you're trying to come up with pitches, so you end up building them up over time. And one of the things I was always worried about early on was that I didn't have good ideas, or I didn't have ideas that were worthy of spending the time on, or I just would never have good ideas at all. So I was quite a bit of a pack rat. I used to collect ideas in these giant folders. And this one was from, I watched an Edward Snowden documentary, I think, and it was 7 or 8 years ago. It was shortly after he ended up in Russia, and he was talking about the ubiquity of data about individuals, and what he, I think, calls digital dust, like how impossible it is to move through, especially modern Western societies, without leaving this trail of dust, this digital dust, wherever you go, and how hard that is to hide. And I was sitting there and I was like, if it's hard to hide, it must also be hard to fake. And that kind of made me think, well, if you, in a world where anyone can do sort of dark web searches on people, you can do all sorts of probing, and you can do just basic background history check. Do they have a LinkedIn profile? There's just so many things that, a false passport and a couple of receipts from a sandwich shop won't, in your wallet, that kind of pocket litter that they would talk about in the Cold War era, it just wouldn't cut the mustard, basically. And I think I just had this sense of that would make for interesting stories if you were trying to produce that kind of information and give someone an identity that would stand up to that kind of scrutiny.
Yeah, technology has certainly made things like that more difficult. I saw a thing just the other day that was talking about various movies and stuff from the 80s and 90s that just wouldn't be possible today because modern technology solves the problem in 2 seconds.
Exactly. Yeah.
So
It's the cell phone
yeah,
problem
yeah.
in horror films. Yeah,
Right.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's very. I think there's definitely an argument to be made that realistic modern spy fiction would mostly be about spreadsheets and in a very uninteresting way.
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
it's about data aggregation and spotting patterns. And I do in the sequel actually. I have because there's quite a lot of scenes where Sally Lime, who's one of the characters in this book, is looking for something and spends a lot of time essentially looking at spreadsheets. But in what I hope is a dramatic way. But I guess the readers will judge that when they read it.
That's right. Yeah. So you mentioned your background is in writing, and you're not. I assume you're not a spy, right? You don't secretly
No,
work for MI6 or SIS,
I
right?
don't. I get this question a lot, and I think it's because there is a grand tradition of obviously people who have been in espionage circles, either glancingly referring to it or making it a key kind of plank of their marketing. David McCloskey talks about his time at the CIA quite a lot and presents a podcast all about intelligence and so on. I'm just some guy who makes it up. I had two brushes with intelligence. The first, in fact, no, really one. Basically, I had to sign the Official Secrets Act when I was at university because I joined the Officer Training Corps, which is like the ROTC, similar thing in the UK. But anyone who serves in any sort of military or governmental capacity in the UK has to sign that. And the second one was just before I moved to London. I did almost join the Intelligence Corps, but a TA unit, a Territorial Army unit, so a reservist unit. And I had like one chat with coffee with the major in charge of that unit. But then I moved to London and never thought about it again. And I think at one point when I was kind of miserable in my first graduate job and I was sitting there one night, I do have a very vague memory. I think I'd had a couple of beers and I was looking up the MI5 website and being like, I feel like I need to find more meaningful work than whatever I was doing at the time. But I think that's about the extent of it. And I did, in fact, sign a clause. I have a clause in my contract, which I checked with some friends who are published by the same people, that they don't have this in theirs, but apparently they insert this clause whenever there's any question of kind of provenance of information, and it essentially says this book does not need to be checked with the intelligence services or any aspect of the military. And I've legally signed on the line to say that MI6 doesn't need to approve anything in this book.
Well, I guess that's proof that you're not
Yeah,
really
it's quite a strong denial, which some people will say means that
you are.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Well, so presumably then you had to do a lot of research. I mean, some of the stuff in the book. I mean, a lot of stuff that comes up in spy fiction, espionage thrillers, and stuff like that could be totally made up, right? And the average reader wouldn't know if it was true or not. But I think I heard Dave McCloskey say one time, tradecraft and stuff doesn't have to be right, but it's nice when it is. So presumably you did a lot of research to write this book. How did that go for you?
Yeah, a lot of my research I do on the fly, as in I think of something that I want to put in the book, and then I work out if it's plausible, and if it is plausible, I see if there's any actual real world precedent for it. But I think there's this, and I think David McCloskey's talked about this as well. There's this sort of osmotic barrier between spy fiction and spy fact, where things that originate in spy fiction end up being used in the real world as terminology or even as methods, and then vice versa. Things from the real world come into fiction, and it sort of circulates around. And there's probably in that Venn diagram there are things that just never make it into fiction because they are too sensitive or they're too esoteric, and no one would ever think. They would probably think that's not realistic if you put it in a book, and vice versa. There's things that are slightly absurd to end up in books that would probably never happen in real life. But I definitely I'm a story first. I'm not looking up tradecraft and trying to figure out how to fit it into the story. I'm writing the story and then figuring out where the tradecraft goes as I write. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff from my own jobs in tech I've got various friends, and my brother is a developer as well, and various other people that I can kind of query about technical stuff. I've got friends in the military. I've now got two ex-CIA officers' email addresses, which is very handy for book two. And David McCloskey did actually save me from an embarrassing error in book two, which was good. So yeah, it's a combination of writing it and then filling in the gaps, but also occasionally just doing a bit of reading in the genre, so reading other people's work, and also reading around the genre, reading histories, reading things and things. Take this idea, take this particular concept, and just give it a twist a little bit. But yeah, a lot of it is just frankly made up.
And you talked about tech and stuff like that, and I think that's one of the things that comes out of this. And actually, I had read a review of the book, and one of the criticisms someone leveled was this idea that in, I think it was 2005 when the book starts, right, that the SIS wouldn't use email and wouldn't know about Google and stuff like that. And my first thought was, well, this is clearly someone who's never been involved with government work.
Yeah,
Because if
or
you've ever
wasn't
worked with
around
the
in
government,
2003.
yeah. So I mean, how realistic is that? Did that come up in your research that they were?
Yeah,
really
I mean, I was
behind the
there. I
times?
remember, like, Google was founded in '98. I remember vividly the first time I saw the Google logo. I was in my university halls, and there was a mature student in there working on an essay, and I remember the really colourful logo, and I said, "What's that?" And he said, "Oh, it's a search engine. It's a bit like Ask Jeeves, but it's much better." Just to really date me.
Yeah.
I started working in London in 2004, and when I got there, I was in my graduate job. I was the first year of graduates that year that got their own laptops issued. Previous to that, they'd had pool laptops, so 4 or 5 graduates on a client work site would all work off one laptop. And I think MI5 only got their first website in 2005. So 2003, 2004 was pre-iPhone. It was pre-Web 2.0. It was just very, very basic internet, and the widespread adoption of the internet was only just starting to kick off. Wikipedia was brand new. So I think it's kind of a collapsed cultural memory that we feel like the internet has always been here and has always been as useful and as ubiquitous as it is now. And that's just not true. And 2003 is over 20 years ago. And the internet as it is currently constituted is only about 20 years ago. So it's only about 20 years old, effectively. So yeah, they're wrong, whoever said that.
Yeah. Yeah, I have teenage kids, and they are shocked. When I tell them, my wife and I will tell stories about in college, to check your email, you had to physically go to a different building, the computer lab, and you had to take a floppy disk. So I then have to explain what a floppy disk is, because you couldn't just check your email. You had to actually have your email software on the floppy disk. So I think you're right. It's so everywhere now. I think we do forget that it wasn't always like that.
And we used to treat emails. We used to treat emails like letters. You would sit down and write a 5-paragraph email to your friend because you wouldn't check it until a week later, and then you go back and go, you exchange these long emails. And the idea of firing sort of 2 or 3 sentence messages back and forward at each other all day was just alien.
Yeah. You mentioned, Jamie, he's Scottish. He has an IT background. You're Scottish. You have an IT background. How much of you is in Jamie?
So, I mean, Jamie's obviously fictional. He's not a real person, but he is from the west of Edinburgh originally. I'm from the west of Edinburgh originally. I think what I would say is, and he's a state school kid. I'm a state school kid. I didn't go to Cambridge. I would say that. I went to Aberdeen. But I've definitely felt what he feels in that I've been out of context. When I first moved to London, I moved to London right before the financial crisis, about 3 or 4 years before, and I was going to parties with like Lehman Brothers interns and things like that, and just sort of looking around me at this environment that I just didn't really understand and wasn't really socially equipped to deal with. But I have a lot of the things that Jamie doesn't have. So I have, a very solid familial safety net, and I have a lot of support that he wouldn't have. So I probably would not have taken the deal that Jamie took. And I think a lot of the imagination that I had to do for Jamie was to basically think about why would he make this sort of devil's bargain. So I do say, you know, there's a lot of overlap, but we're not the same person. And I think any character you write is going to contain some element of, you know, because you're essentially modeling another person in your brain. So you're going to be operating off the data you have available, which is what's in your head. So every character, I think, is starting from some sort of common structure that comes from you ultimately. But yeah, he's got a lot in common with me, but he's not me.
Yeah. Another character that I really liked was the character of Nicola. I think it's sort of another trope in fiction, particularly spy fiction, that tends to be very masculine oriented, right? To have this sort of damsel in distress. You think of the James Bond, the Bond girls, right? There's always some woman who shows up who is more or less helpless, needs Bond to help her out, and it's almost a complete turnaround in the book, as she is the expert and Jamie kind of ends up being the damsel in distress, so to speak. So was that a conscious choice that you made to reverse those gender roles, or did you just happen to make her female? Or
yeah, I think I'm firmly of the belief that all choices in narrative are conscious ones ultimately. Like, even if you're kind of even if you're not sitting there going, I am going to make this character this kind of person. I Nicola didn't exist in my head except as a name until I wrote the scene where she's introduced. And that's true of Jamie as well. Jamie didn't exist until I sat down and wrote the scene where he appears in the college quad at Cambridge, and he walks in. When he sidled into the college quad, that was him also appearing for me. Because I structure and I plan my novels quite closely, but the character stuff, I kind of allow that to arise through the drafting process. And Nicola, when I was writing her, she's kind of in some ways, both her and Sally Lime are composites of a bunch of incredibly competent, effective women that I've worked with in various jobs that I've known in various social contexts as well. And I think the security services and the military both are incredibly densely populated with incredibly competent women who are very, very good at their jobs. And when I wanted somebody to be handling this horrible mistake of putting an untrained, unprepared guy into what's supposed to be a covert operation, when I wanted somebody to handle that on the scene and deal with that, I was like, I need somebody who is going to be really like grounded and be able to calm him down and also give the benefit of experience. And that was Nicola. And I think as I wrote more and more of her, that strengthened that impression that this was the right choice for the character.
I think it works really well. One of the other things I really liked and found interesting was the way that the book kind of goes back and forth between London and Africa. And I think it makes this very kind of complex overall story where it kind of weaves in different things that are happening in different locations. London, obviously a very common kind of place for spy novels. You mentioned you live in London and work in London, so it's a place you know very well. How did you decide to set the rest of the action in Tanzania and Zanzibar, Africa?
So I don't live in London anymore. I lived in London until 2010 and then moved back to Scotland. So I'm in Scotland now, but I lived there for 6 years. I'm there all the time for work and for publishing stuff now as well. Zanzibar, however, and East Africa more generally, I have not been to since 2002. So again, over 20 years ago. And essentially, in my between my second and third year of university, I think, my then girlfriend and I decided we were just going to go backpacking for the summer, and we went to, which was not a great decision financially because we essentially couldn't afford it. We basically went on an absolute shoestring and had a great time, but we didn't have much operating margin. But we went to Kenya and then down to Moshi, which is where Kilimanjaro, the foot of Kilimanjaro is. But we couldn't do anything when we got there because we had no money. So we just basically hung out and, had some food and read books in various hostels. And then we went to Dar es Salaam, and Dar es Salaam just was one of the most different places I'd ever been because, I'd grown up in Scotland, which is rainy and cold and grey. And this was just the polar opposite of that in every regard. And we spent about a week in Dar es Salaam and then decided to go to Zanzibar, and we went to Stone Town and then up to Nungwi. And we just had an absolutely incredible time. Even though we were doing it on a complete shoestring, it was just one of those sort of peak travel experiences that just sticks with you. And it's always stuck with me. And the scene in the night market when Jamie first arrives on Zanzibar and he's and Nicola's trying to find him, or trying to find what she thinks is Agent Garnet, who is the stand-in for Jamie. She hasn't realised at that point that the wrong guy is on the mission. That scene where she's walking around the night market looking for him, and then she spots him standing watching these guys cutting cane sugar to squeeze it out for the cane sugar juice. That's directly taken from my memory because there's this night market that's there 7 nights a week right by the harbour in Stone Town, and it starts as soon as the sun goes down and it goes on till 10 o'clock at night. And that was just this incredibly vivid memory that I had that I basically just threw straight onto the page. But obviously, a lot of things change in 20 years. When I went, mobile phones there was one or two, but now they're ubiquitous. Smartphones are ubiquitous. Drones are ubiquitous. Rwanda does like remote drone blood delivery now, that kind of thing. So the tech situation has changed dramatically in East Africa, and it's changed as a region, and and Tanzania and Zanzibar have changed as countries. And then I was like, I don't know what I don't know. So I did a lot of Street View to check my memories of which streets connected to which. A lot of Google, a lot of reading. So it was a combination of my memories, my sort of 20-plus-year-old memories, and just a lot of reading and a lot of Googling.
Well, it was really interesting. It's like I said, it's a place that you don't see very often, and I kind of like to get to know new places. I really liked the inclusion of that.
Well, a friend of mine was actually on holiday in Zanzibar with he took the ebook with him, and he was reading it while he was there, and he said, I can tell you, I can tell you've been here at some point in the past, but you've kind of like it does read like a contemporary account of Zanzibar of 2025, 2026. So it doesn't feel dated. It feels good.
Yeah.
So I was like, good. I've had it on the spot checked by my friend who's there with his family.
That's good. I imagine Google Maps and Google Street View are super helpful in regards to things like that. You can't necessarily go everywhere in the world and walk around, but you can.
No, I mean, I use them constantly. There's all these different tools I use. So there's one called Rome to Rio, which is an amazing travel planning tool. But you can essentially say, I want to get from this place to this place, and it will give you all the different routes that you can take, all the different transport options, the rough costs, the schedules, and it will just generate all these options for you. And spy novels have a lot of people like traveling around and going from place to place, and that kind of tool and Google Maps and these things are just invaluable for basically avoiding embarrassing errors. Like in the first draft of this, I had him going via Istanbul on a flight that would have landed like a day and a half later, so the timeline would have been completely off. And then Rome to Rio was like, no, you would need to go through this connection and it would take this long, and I was able to go through it and update all that, because you think, oh, most readers wouldn't be bothered, but you will always get an email from somebody who's like, actually, I think you'll find this flight doesn't depart on that date.
Yeah, and especially I feel like people who read spy fiction tend to be that
detail
sort of person. They're
oriented.
detail oriented.
Yes, yeah.
We like complicated plots, but yeah.
Yeah, so far I've got off fairly lightly. I had one person who pointed out that 747s don't generally land at City Airport, which is fair enough because the runway's too short. Although there was apparently briefly a service where they loaded extra fuel so that they could do the transatlantic hop without having to land in Ireland or something, and they briefly ran a 747 service out of the city. So I claim a technicality on that one. And a gentleman who pointed out that I'd used the phrase carbine rifle, which is a contradiction in terms. So two errors out of a fairly technical novel, I think, is not too bad.
Yeah, that's not bad at all, especially for things that are what I think most of us would call, fairly nitpicky.
Niche.
Yeah, niche is a good way to say it. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. So, um, you've gotten a lot of good reviews from this. The Sun compared you pretty favorably to Mick Herron and David McCloskey, two folks that are very popular in the community. Pretty good company. What are there writers or books that you'd say, if you're listening to this podcast and you like X, you'll like A Reluctant Spy?
Yeah, I wouldn't hold a candle to. I wouldn't say I hold a candle to Matt Cairns' prose. He's an exceptional writer and a very nice guy. I've learned because I've met him a couple of times now at different events. But I think McCarran tonally is absolutely a good comparison point. I think there's a similar dash of humor. There's a similar, slightly occasionally over the top action sequences, and I definitely, if there's a spectrum, and at one end you have sort of Roger Moore era Bond, flying cars and so on, and at the other end you have sort of people with beer stains on their ties sitting in Vauxhall Vectras watching warehouses, the kind of real Le Carre-esque kind of hardcore. I think the stale beer end of the spectrum is what Shane calls it. I think I'm roughly in the middle, and I'm in the middle alongside McCarran, and perhaps the Bourne novels are slightly towards the exploding end of the spectrum, and the McCloskey and Spybrary are slightly towards the McCarran. They're slightly closer to the Le Carre end of the spectrum. So I'm hanging out in the middle with McCarran, which is a good place to be.
I think so too. Yeah, I told Shane when we first started talking, I can get into the sort of explosion Jack Carr, what I would call like a popcorn movie kind of version of a book, beach read.
Yeah, I think he calls them the Kalashnikov kids, which yeah, which I think is a good name if slightly derisive.
Yeah, yeah. And of course at the other end, like you said, Le Carre, Graham Greene, wonderful, but also sort of have to be in the right place to sit down with those. And what I find the sweet spot is like you said, right there in the middle, very accessible. It's enough action to kind of keep you moving and hold your interest, but not so much that it's, like you said, it just becomes more about shoot 'em ups, as they would say. So
yeah, and I think A Reluctant Spy, definitely the kinetic nature of the book goes rapidly up towards the end, but it does have a fair amount of people stalking around and following each other and doing sort of more traditional tradecraft stuff in the first maybe half of the book. But yeah, I think I wanted to escalate at the end, and I did.
Yeah, I was going to say, without getting into spoilers, so we won't discuss details or stuff. It does, like you said, it gets significantly more kinetic towards the end. It's almost a different book at times. What was your thought with that? You said you wanted it to be more kinetic.
Yeah, I think it's a kind of the stew into which Jamie is thrown is a violent one, and I think the nature of the core plot is following these essentially Russian mercenaries. They're loosely based on Wagner and loosely based on Yevgeny Prigozhin, and these kind of, I think what they're known as dark triad, sort of, not triad as in the criminal syndicate, but dark triad as in these narcissistic monsters essentially that drive a lot of the really negative things in our world, because they have these drives for power, and there are a lot of men like that in that world, in the world of contracting and armed mercenary groups and defense and security. And I was thinking, what is the natural next step? Because the book is actually set very slightly in the future. It's set after the collapse of the current regime in Russia, so it's set in a sort of a rerun of the 90s, where totalitarian or autocratic regime has collapsed, and there's this rush, almost a gold rush of various people trying to establish power, and some of those people want to establish a nascent democracy, and other people want to essentially repeat what Putin did in the 90s, which is just consolidate power and essentially turn the place into a mafia state. And Arkady Bacharov is one of them. He's the kind of antagonist of the book, and I think I was thinking, what's the sort of updated version of what Putin did in the 90s in St. Petersburg and then later in Moscow, and how might that happen and where might it happen? It's probably not happening in Russia because of the distributed nature of the security states and the interests that Russian security firms have all over the world. And I thought, okay, well, if he's going to do that, what's the next escalation from what allegedly Putin did in the 90s? How might it escalate? And once I'd made the decision to escalate in the way that I did with Bacharov, that meant the response had to proportionally escalate as well. So that's a very hazy and vague way to answer that question. Yeah. But it's essentially, how big are the stakes? And if those stakes are that large, what does that mean in terms of the narrative response by the protagonist and the people supporting him?
Yeah, I do think, like you said, it's a very natural progression given everything that's going on. We can't just say, well, that's that. And when they wrapped it up neatly. So,
yeah. And bluntly as well, I wanted people to just get really excited and keep turning the pages.
Yeah.
But I didn't want it to be a sort of one-man army, all I need is an assault vest and a Kalashnikov and I can take on a base full of guys. I wanted it to be much more a reflection, semi-realistic reflection of how an operation might happen. So, there are lots of parties involved and lots of moving parts and drones and all sorts of things going on. So that way of war, that kind of special operations way of war is, I think, a unique one in human history. We haven't really had that kind of incredibly technologically overmatched type of thing going on really ever. And it's a fascinating imbalance that has its own sort of carries its own dramas in some interesting ways. Some really good films about drone warfare and about the sort of removal of the human element from warfare, which I think makes for an interesting kind of drama in its own way. Although there's plenty of boots on the ground in this book.
Yeah. The book has gotten a lot of good press. You've gotten some awards, the Bloody Scotland Debut Prize, the McDermott Debut Award. Obviously, it's always great to get awards, right? But is this something that were you caught off guard by this, or were you sort of like, yeah, this is going to do well?
Very, very much caught off guard.
Yeah.
So I sold this book on proposal, which is quite unusual for debuts. Normally, for a debut novel, you will write the whole book and then submit it. But because of the unusual way that I sold the book to my editor Toby, I essentially wrote a sample, about 15,000 words, and a pitch for the rest of the book, and sent that over. And he bought the book based on that. Got it through acquisitions, but they were quite clear. They said, you're not going to be a lead title, which is quite unusual. Normally in publishing, everyone's like, we'll give this book an amazing push. It's going to be great. And Toby, to his credit, was quite honest with me. He said, you're a first time author. We've sold this on proposal, but we're going to see what we can do with it. It's going to be, so I feel like it was a bit of a punt, really. Like, let's give it a go. And the book went out and I got really good publicity support, which got me some really good press coverage. And then there's Goldsborough Books as well in London. They do signed special editions, but signed first special editions. So they'll order a quantity and they'll put them in subscription boxes, or they'll sell them in their store. And they had a thing called Crime Collective, which is their new crime and thriller subscription box. And they chose Reluctant Spy as the launch title for that, which was just incredible, because it got the book in front of loads of really passionate crime and thriller readers who I don't think would otherwise have known that it existed. And as a debut author, like, obscurity is your number one problem, like just people not knowing who you are at all. So I think that combined with the press coverage, I think just got the book the visibility that it wouldn't have otherwise got. And I've been trying to do my part. I've been doing a lot of podcasts. I've been going around bookshops signing books and saying hello to people, but I am just one man and I can't really compete with that kind of reach. And I think it's just a little, you never quite know which one small thing is going to snowball into another thing. And I don't know how I got onto the shortlists for, I know that publishers submitted me, but every publisher in the UK is probably submitting dozens of books. They get read by readers who read all the submissions, and then that gets put into a long list and then a short list and so on. And I actually got the call about the McDermott Debut Award at the Harrogate Crime Festival about one day before the call about Bloody Scotland. They called me 2 days apart, and I was like, oh my God, I got nominated for an award, and I was beside myself. And then I got a phone call from Bob, who's the festival director at Bloody Scotland. I was going to do a panel at Bloody Scotland anyway, and I thought he was phoning me about that. And he said, really pleased to tell you you're on the shortlist for the debut prize. And I just didn't know what to say. I nearly dropped the phone. So it was very much just sort of pinching myself constantly for about 6 months. And then to win both of them was, I hoped I might win one, but I really couldn't have told you which of them I had a better chance. So the other writers were all amazing and just really lovely people. And we had this incredible sort of three-month period where we were all doing promotions together, and we were all meeting up at festivals, and we had a group chat, and it was all incredibly friendly and just a really good introduction to the writing scene. But then, I just wasn't prepared. Thankfully, I wrote a speech for the first one because I was really worried that if I did win, by chance I would end up just sort of blabbering and not making much sense. So I wrote a speech, and I'm really glad that I did, because I would have just broken down on the spot if I hadn't had something to focus on. But yeah, it was crazy first year.
Yeah, I bet. Now, you mentioned a sequel. First is, does the 2 awards put the pressure on you for the sophomore project here, or?
Thankfully, it was well written. So I wrote the sequel I started in December last year. I had it handed in by April, and I found out I was nominated for the awards in May. Okay. And then it was all announced in June, July. And I didn't all come to fruition until the end of September. So by the time I was starting to put award winning in my biography, which is still a weird thing to think about, the book was in post-production. And I just did second pass pages, which is, looking to check the typos have all been fixed, sort of thing, just about a week ago. So yeah, it's kind of out of my hands at this point. And I did the drafting just in the relative obscurity of being published and having a few people who'd said they'd enjoyed the book, but it was before all of the sort of hoo-ha. So yeah, it was good. But also because I wrote the first book on proposal, I haven't had that kind of sophomore slump the second book syndrome that you quite often hear about, because I wrote the first book under deadline, based on a pitch, and I wrote the second book in the same way. And I'm hopefully embarking on a third book as well. So far, fingers crossed, I haven't had a real sort of, this is really hard and I don't know what to do. No more than any book is hard to write.
Right. What can you give us can you tell us anything about the book?
Yeah, I can. We're going to try and see if I can do it without spoiling the first book. Oh, yeah. So it's called Solitary Agents. It's a sequel, direct sequel to Reluctant Spy, but it is also, you can read it as a standalone, because the events of the first book, while they are important to the character, Jamie Tulloch, who, I guess that's a spoiler, he's not going to die in the first book, but because he's in the second one. But it's about him going back to his civilian life and then realizing that he's kind of got a taste for the covert life, for the secret world. And at the same time, there's another character called Sam Lee, who is she's got nothing to do with intelligence, but she's working a horrible sort of grinding corporate lawyer job and is miserable. But she has a friend who's a talent spotter for MI5. And the main action of the book is that Jamie joins SIS and goes through SIS core officer training. And then Sam joins MI5, or the security service, and she goes through basically the same thing, but for Thames House. And there's essentially a thing called Exercise Red Poacher, which is at the end of the course. The MI5 trainees try to defend a bunch of different installations, and the MI6 trainees try to infiltrate them. So it's like, and it's described in the book as like the Oxford-Cambridge boat race, but for spies. And that's the kind of setup for the book. But then what happens is they witness what they believe to be a murder happening during the exercise, but nobody believes them. And Jamie is not sure if it's part of the exercise, and Sam knows that it's not part of the exercise, but she can't prove it. And then, so somebody is trying to subvert this exercise and try to potentially recruit assets through it. And it all goes Pete on from there.
Well, sounds great. When can we expect it?
It's out on June 6th of next year, so 2026. So it's, June 4th. And it comes out in hardback and ebook on June 4th.
Is that in the UK and the US at the same time, or?
I think the US is generally about 3 months later for the hardback, because they have to be shipped across the Atlantic. But the ebook will be available at the same time, yeah.
Great. Okay. Well, we're looking forward to it. Well, it's been great talking with you. Hopefully, some of our listeners now will pick up the book and enjoy it as much as I have. Any final words that you want to leave with folks?
Just it's an absolute honor to be on Spybrary. When I started getting back into spy fiction, Spybrary was one of the first podcasts I came across, and it was just it was a source of kind of recommendations, and just it was really great to realize there was other people who were as into this genre as I was. So yeah, I'm just delighted to be on the show.
And that brings us to the end of today's episode. My thanks to David Goodman for such a thoughtful conversation, and to Bryan Boling. Didn't he do well guiding this conversation? I have to share with you, interviewing and hosting is not as easy as it looks and sounds. So that's an excellent first go, Bryan. Looking forward to many more of these from you. If you'd like to learn more about David Goodman, his books, his writing, his upcoming work, his website, etc., you'll find all the links, because I know many of you are currently out evading your tail, or maybe you're working out in the gym, you're on a stakeout. You'll find all the links to his books and information over at spybrary.com/Goodman. As always, thank you for listening in. Thank you for supporting Spybrary. We do have a Patreon up and running. That's allowing me to raise some money to pay for editing costs, but also to hire writers for spybrary.com. If you head on over to Spybrary, we redesigned the website. So now we have reviews, opinions, features, etc. And you'll be helping us with that. And you can find that at spybrary.com/support. And we'll be back very, very soon with more conversations from the world of spy fiction and espionage history. And if you cannot wait for the next episode, do join us in the Spybrary community. That's spybrary.com/community. And we have almost 5,000 fellow spy nerds in there talking about spy books and espionage history every single day. Blows my mind the amount of conversations that are going on in there. Plays havoc on my bank account, buying all these books that are recommended. So until then, stay safe and take care.